Hello, everyone. You're very welcome to the seminar today. My name is Rebecca Stuart from the University of Neuchâtel here in Switzerland, and today's seminar will be presented by Dror Goldberg from the Open University of Israel on the topic of deception through credible commitment, secret inflationary finance in Israel's War of Independence. And just before I hand over to Dror, just to reiterate the rules of engagement. If you have questions, please write them in the Q&A. If most of the questions we'll take at the end, but if there are clarification questions during the presentation, I will ask them to Dror during the presentation. But for the most part, we'll keep all the questions towards the end. And with that, I'll pass right over to Dror for his presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca, and everyone for joining. I will try to share the presentation. Okay. So in 1948, during the War of Independence, the Israeli government tried to define what would be the end of the war. And they decided that the war will end when Israel has peace agreements with all its neighbors. According to this criterion, we are not there yet. The War of Independence is still not over. Right now, we are going through one of the most terrible battles of this war. So 75 years and counting. Many of you are Europeans. You know, the Dutch War of Independence was the 80 Years' War. So maybe we will break this record. So I'm actually talking to you right now from a war zone, as you surely know. And I have to mention that there could be a rocket siren any moment. We had one yesterday. If that happens, I will close the microphone and camera and relocate to a better protected room in my apartment, and I will continue from there. So it could happen. I hope not. Either way, it could be the first time for you. So this is about what we still call today the War of Independence, just a period of less than 2 years, 1947 to 1949. And I'm going to claim that there was some secret inflationary finance going on that nobody ever realized before. And it used actually the device of credible commitment not to inflate, but it used it in a weird way. It used the credible commitment to deceive the public as a red herring, to show them, hey, we're making a credible commitment, and actually they went around it and did inflationary finance anyway. So what do scholars know about it? It's not a very famous inflationary episode because the increase in the quantity of money was not very large compared to other wars. The inflation was very severely repressed with price controls and rationing. And it is well known and acknowledged that some inflation was critical for survival during the war. And the very few historians who looked into the financing of this war, they saw money printing data, and they said, okay, money printing caused the inflation, which is true for the later part of the war, the less interesting part of the war. I'm going to argue that what was really important was an increase in the quantity of money, not through printing, and in the earlier phase of the war. So there was something like a central bank, not formal, and the red herring, which I mentioned, was a credible commitment not to print, literally not to print too much currency. But still, this so-called central bank was able to increase the quantity of money simply on the books. It didn't have to print the currency, you know, a fractional reserves. You don't have to print currency to increase the quantity of money. It simply increased the balances of the government. The government sold it treasury bills, and the bank increased the balances of the government and could withdraw currency as long as there was enough in the reserves. And that's it. The promise not to print money was useful indirectly to deceive the public and the enemies as well. And this war finance method was helped by censorship on most financial information at the macro level, and it was motivated by national security reasons. So it seemed critical for the country's survival to keep this a secret. What's the timeline? So in November 1947, the UN decided to split the country into Jewish and Arab states, and civil war began immediately. Half a year later, the State of Israel was founded, and all its neighbors and some other neighbors invaded in order to destroy the country completely. In early January, that was the last battle of the war, and then there was half a year of diplomacy, and the last armistice agreement, not peace agreement, obviously, that was signed in July. I'm going to focus on the period from independence to the very last day of 1948, which is just a few days before the last battle, and you will see the reason later. So that's what I'm interested in. Obviously, most economic historians who try to look into this period were very discouraged by the lack of credible data. There was the fog of war was really consequential. Huge changes in population, employment, GDP, everything was severely changed, and measuring it in real time was not very easy. So most economic historians looked at the period immediately after that, from 1949, when things became normal and you could have credible data. So I'm going to do the opposite. And what did I find out? So first of all, from the newspapers, that's my public information. Obviously, there wasn't television yet anywhere, and the radio broadcasts were not documented, so I don't have access to what people said. From the newspapers, this is what I know that the public knew about the government's budget. The costs of the war, there were domestic and foreign. I'm going to talk only about the domestic costs. When the British left in May 1948, there wasn't a military force for the Jewish state, and they had to immediately import airplanes, tanks, cannons, ships, everything, like start an army from scratch. These were the foreign costs. Or these are things that they had to import from elsewhere, and that was almost entirely taken care of by donations of Jews living abroad. I'm going to talk only about the domestic costs of paying soldiers, buying guns and ammunition and food in Israel for the war. And it was public knowledge, it was foolishly published in the newspapers at the beginning, that the cost was £4 million, that would be MP from now on, £4 million per month. Now, everybody knew that the all taxes were just £1 million a month. And it was also known that the civilian budget was the same amount. So it was common knowledge, if anybody paid attention to the newspapers, that the taxes that the government collected covered only the civilian budget. And the military budget was 4 times higher. How did they finance it? So there were 2 loans, one in the very beginning of the period, one in the very end. In the beginning, there was a national loan. There was a very publicized effort to get money from the public. They wanted £5 million, and the newspapers gave this data, which I plotted here. So we know for the first 2 weeks, they almost reached 3 million. Then in June, almost nothing. And then by the middle of July, they managed to collect those £5 million. Just to remind you, the cost of the war per month was 4 million. And here it took them 5 million to collect over 2 months. Actually, everything that they collected in July was to cover the expenses from June, paying for creditors who supplied the ammunition and guns and food. And then at the end of the period, we have ordinary inflationary finance out in the open. The government prints treasury bills, sells it to a bank, which I will talk about later. and gets a currency in return. So £5 million within the last month of 1948. So that's also about the amount of money they needed for December. So we have war finance for May, June, and December. In the middle, nothing. The public knew nothing. What there was in the middle was the legal framework for the inflationary finance. In the middle of August, there is a currency ordinance, which says that some bank, which I will talk about in a minute, can issue currency to replace the currency of the British Mandate for Palestine. And this bank can give this currency to the government for treasury bills. That's what the ordinance from August says. Took 2 more months to come up with an ordinance how treasury bills need to be issued. Then another month of bureaucracy to set up this treasury bill thing, supposedly, and only in the end of November they start issuing treasury bills for currency. Out in the open, inflationary finance. So how was the war financed between July and November? That's a pretty significant part of the war. I'll skip this, never mind. So that's how they financed it. They financed it by loans that the public did not know about. £18 million over a period of 5 months. That was completely secret. This was also a case of the government issuing treasury bills and selling them to a bank. It's the same bank that was involved later with the inflationary finance. It was called the Anglo-Palestine Bank, but that was done completely in secret. Nobody knew a thing about it, as far as I can tell from the newspapers. And as I will show you later, according to the gold market, apparently nobody knew a thing. So that was the inflationary finance, which actually kept the military going for a very long time, and nobody apparently knew nothing about it. So the blue is the public information, and the orange, that was the secret. I don't have the exact timeline after October, but I do know, and this is important, that on the very last day of the year, according to later financial statements, it reached £18 million. I assume that this amount was reached about here when they started the open inflationary finance. So that's how the IDF was funded for a bit more than half of the war, which is pretty amazing. So something about this bank. It was called Anglo-Palestine Bank. It was nominally a private bank registered in London, and that was the official bank of the Zionist movement, but it was also the largest bank in Israel. By far, it held more than 50% of all the deposits. In August 1948, during this, when they made this currency ordinance that authorized this bank to issue currency, they split it, following a century-old example, the Bank of England. They split it into a banking department and an issue department. The banking department was a private bank, as the entire bank had been up to that point. And obviously, it didn't have to report anything to anyone until the end of the year with its financial statements. The issue department, that was de facto central bank, and that one was much more transparent, as I will show you later. And the issue department was kind of the public arm of the bank, and this one is the part of the bank that issued the currency from that point. So how did the bank create money? Well, in 2 ways. So there was the public face of the bank, the issue department, and as I said, it started doing it in late November, and there was this very critical, credible commitment that no more than half of the currency could be backed by treasury bills, namely backed by the government's promise to have enough money in the future to pay it. The other half had to be gold or foreign currency or currency of the British Mandate, which was supposed to be convertible in Britain into sterling. So half had to be backed by real assets and the other half just by the government's promise. And why did they promise it? because the public was very, very afraid of inflation. There was post-war inflation all over the world. The newspapers mentioned the Chinese hyperinflation that was going on in real time as the Republic of China was fighting for its life. And the inflations of the world wars and the interwar period, they were living memory for everyone in charge, specifically the German hyperinflation. Everybody in the financial sector knew about it because the Jews who immigrated from Germany completely dominated the financial sector. So everyone was very afraid of inflation. So they made this credible commitment not to print too much money. All right, that's the public face. The secret private face of the bank was the banking department, which didn't need to report anything it did. And here they just bought treasury bills. And I have the exact documents in the Israeli state archives. The treasury every week sends a treasury bill of £1 million and asks the bank, please increase my balances by £1 million. That's it. And as long as there was enough currency in the bank, it worked. And they did this from June to November, £18 million. That was by far the larger amount. And I will emphasize this point again, from July to November, that was the only method of war finance. Without this method, there would have been no IDF, there would have been no Israel. Now, the issue department was very, very transparent. The example of the Bank of England was that both the issue department and the banking department had to report their balances every week. But in Israel, only the issue department did it. That was the critical difference. That was the red herring. The issue department reported every week in all the newspapers, its assets and the liabilities. So this is the very first report from August. The bottom line is important. Banknotes in circulation, that's 6.5 million Israeli pounds. LI is Israeli pounds. What do they have to cover it? Well, look at the first line, how transparent they are. No gold, we have no gold. We are not trying to fool you. Look, first line, we have no gold. That remained at zero throughout the entire period. You cannot be more transparent than that. We have no gold. We wish we had, but we don't have. Next line, foreign currencies, that's actually US dollars, $1.5 million. And currency of the British Mandate for Palestine, £5 million. And zero in treasury bills. That's important. The issue department held zero in treasury bills. At the same time, what you don't know is that the banking department, the private department of the bank, already had at that point in time £6 million in treasury bills, but they did not report the balances, so nobody knew about it. And it kind of continued like this until late November. No gold, zero, no treasury bills. These amounts increased, reached 26 million eventually, as the public converted the Palestine currency with Israeli currency. And the issue department showed every week zero until late November. That was the brilliant fraud here. So I'm arguing that the issue department reassured the public, and it kept inflation expectations low by showing, well, we have this commitment of not issuing too many treasury bills, and until late November, we don't have any treasury bills. We don't even have a treasury bills ordinance yet. That was enacted only in October, even though they started doing it in secret already in June. So that was the credible commitment, and it was useful as a red herring, nothing more than that. And the point of fractional reserve was critical. So there's one way to increase the amount of money with currency. The other method is by doing it on the bank's books. Now, I need to mention that all my evidence regarding public information so far comes from the newspapers. The newspapers were heavily subjected to military censorship. Is it possible that everybody knew, but the information recorded in the censored newspapers is misleading? So went to the gold market. That was reported every day in most newspapers. And that's the blue line. And for comparison, I found in The Economist only gold prices in Bombay, because in the Bretton Woods era, most gold markets were kind of not active, but in India there was a gold market, and The Economist reported it every day or every week, kind of depends on the period. So for comparison, you have the two lines. What do we have here? We have two very, very volatile periods, and I'll tell you what these are. They have nothing to do with war events. As I detail in the paper, none of the war events can explain these extremely volatile periods. What happened here is that already in March, the British government excluded the Palestine pound from the sterling currency area. So there was this currency area of sterling in all the British colonies and dominions. And 2 months before the British left, they to sow a chaos, they decided to take this currency off and make it into a foreign currency as far as Britain was concerned. So that caused a huge volatility and an increase in the price of gold, because the Palestine pound, the currency of the British mandate, kind of lost credibility when it was so bluntly cut off from sterling. So there you have this jump. Then you have the Declaration of Independence, very critical periods in the war, in the first months. You see nothing with gold prices. And in early June, newspapers start reporting rumors that there's going to be an Israeli currency. And almost all the stories come with the fear that there is going to be inflationary finance. And these fears get accelerated in July, and it goes exponential in early August. Very wild speculation. And then this very volatile period, and right about here, the currency ordinance is revealed for the first time after it passes, and it reassures the public. And we have the gold prices going down, converging back to the level of India. So I conclude that the currency law, with this credible commitment not to hyperinflate, it reassured the public. It also tells me that the secret was not leaked. So the newspapers report the right picture. That's what people actually knew. The secret was not leaked. If, on the other hand, the situation was that everybody knew, but the newspapers could not report it, we would see the price of gold exploding. But it did not. It was no longer volatile, and it actually started converging back to the level in India. So I conclude that the trick actually worked. The public was actually fooled by the credible commitments. Why the secrecy? Well, if the enemy, which is 6 Arab countries outnumbering Israel 40-1 in population, if they had known that Israel had no resources to finance the war, maybe they would have been emboldened. Maybe they would have tried to lengthen the war of attrition. The Israeli public might have lost all hope of winning this existential war. And there could have been a bank run if the public had known that the government was withdrawing £1 million a month without putting anything tangible in the bank to cover it. There could have been a bank run on the biggest bank in the country. The economy could have collapsed, then the state would have collapsed. That's why the secrecy. Only in August 1949, the secrecy ends because the bank's financial statements are published. And then, only then, the banking department shows what it had done. Well, not exactly. It only showed the balances for the last day of 1948, £18 million. And the newspapers, they are shocked. They had no idea. And even then they speculated that it all started in late November, when inflationary finance was out in the open. They had no idea, and researchers had no idea until now, that this inflationary finance started in June. And the newspapers write, there was statistical blackout on finance. Blackout operations stubbornly performed on all financial issues. So this was not only the end of secrecy, it's also the proof that there was secrecy. Now, I have some other implicit proof of secrecy and even deception. Regarding secrecy, I found in Ben-Gurion's diary, which was published many years later, that he ordered the censorship of war costs. So initially they published it was 4 million pounds a week, 4 million pounds a month. And then they got their act together and they decided, together with other strategic issues that he listed in his diary, that this could not go on. They cannot tell the public and the enemy what's the cost, especially when they publish the taxes and the civilian budget. They cannot publish war costs anymore. Then, more than 25 years later, we have an account, a somewhat confused account of an old man, David Horowitz, who was the strongman of the Ministry of Finance during the war. And in a somewhat confused paragraph, he does confess explicitly to duplicity. He doesn't say exactly the story that I say. Again, he's a bit confused. It's been, it had been many years earlier, but he does admit that they created inflation, that they had to do it because there was no other way. And he does confess that there was some deception in the usage of the term treasury bills and in 1949, land bills, to fool the public, as if there was anything tangible behind the currency. So that's my indirect proof that there was this atmosphere of deception at the Treasury. So what happened to inflation, if there was inflationary finance? So throughout this period of secret inflationary finance, we have two indices, but everybody knew that inflation was actually far higher than that. There was public outcry in October. Why was the inflation undermeasured? Well, there was price controls on almost all food items. Many other items were rationed, and the underground economy, one of the government members confessed, was actually larger than the formal economy at some point. So the measure of inflation was a joke. Everybody felt it was much higher than that. So under pressure, eventually the government in November appointed someone to coordinate actions against inflation among all the government ministries. Today in the US, they would call it an inflation czar. And who did they choose to do this job? Well, the man with the most credible, credible position, the most prestigious financial man in Israel, the chairman of the bank. He was actually a Dutch financier, Eliezer Hoefijn, who was called. And it's kind of funny because on the one hand, this bank chairman secretly, he's pumping money to the economy, £1 million a week, the entire military budget, he's paying it every week secretly. And then his reputation, which was still not tarnished because that was a secret, he's the inflation czar. So that was quite an amazing act by the government. So I cannot even measure exactly what was the inflation, unfortunately. I cannot even come close. So I don't have any data about quantity of money and resulting inflation. That's simply not possible for this period. Now, I suppose many of you are Europeans, and Joel Mokir actually gave me some hints that could have been some German inspiration. And the more I dug, I found more and more examples. So it's not exactly copying Germany, but it's at least inspiration. And if any of you know some serious sources, preferably in English, because I don't read German, this could be very helpful. So beginning in World War I, there were these special banks that could issue currency. It was not backed by gold, it was not legal tender, and it was meant to circumvent the gold cover of the central banks in actually to print money and not cause the central bank to print beyond the gold limit. Now, that's not exactly what happened here, but it is important that it is cited in an Israeli newspaper in 1948. And it could have been known to people who immigrated from Germany. As I mentioned earlier, the Jewish immigrants from Germany completely dominated the financial sector of Israel. And maybe some of them knew about it, and they could have brought the idea to Israel, at least to the press, probably to the treasury as well. Then in the Great Depression, there was these special bills, not currency. They printed bills backed by nothing, gave it to the central bank. The central bank gave them currency, and they used these proceeds to pay for public works instead of the government. So this was actually the public budget, but it was not in the government budget. So formally, it was not a fiscal expansion. That started in 1932. This one also could have been known to immigrants to Israel. The third thing was directly inspired by the second thing. It was called the MEFO bills. So the Nazi Minister of Finance, Schacht, he established this dummy company called Metallurgical Research Society. And this society secretly paid armament companies, not with currency, but with these bills, commercial bills actually. It was not only off the government budget, it also circumvented the legal limit on how much the central bank can give to the government for its budget. Now, obviously, I cannot assume that Jewish people at the central bank or at the treasury knew about it and brought this information to Israel. I can assume that there were no Jewish financiers doing that. That would be pretty crazy. But this mechanism was very well publicized in the Nuremberg trials because Schacht was one of the accused. Unfortunately, he was acquitted. So all these three items could have been known in Israel. One of them, which is it's a bit more distant from what Israel actually did, but it's kind of a similar level of fooling the public. So it's also relevant, I think. Any one of these could have inspired this duplicity that Israel did in order to finance its war of independence. And again, if you have any clear information about this, I'd be happy to find better sources because right now I don't have much that I can read in English. So what can I conclude about inflation? Well, if you think about the Anglo-Palestine Bank as a central bank, and not as a commercial bank with a fractional reserve, then you can see that the monetary base can increase not only by printing, it can also increase on the central bank's books. And in 2008, as you surely recall, the Fed increased the monetary base, actually doubled it within a month or two. So that was kind of similar. Now, it was important to affect inflation expectations, which is something that people talked a lot about in 22 and also in this current year, because in the short run, this could affect inflation itself. And if you manipulate the information, you can manipulate the expectations, and that itself can lower inflation in the short run. And there was actually this imitation of the Bank of England was actually optimal because they managed to do it by using this structure of the Bank of England, which everybody in Israel knew about. That was very well known. So they used this, let's say, German duplicity, and they didn't have to come up with a special corporation like they did in Germany in those three cases. They already had it by splitting the bank following the English example. So they already had within the Bank of England structure, they had this public branch and the private branch, and imposing what I presume is the German example of deception, it worked perfectly. They didn't have to invent a new corporation to pull it off. More general, for credible commitment. So there was a credible commitment not to print too much money. And secretly, actually, they did increase the quantity of money. There was absolutely no ability to enforce this commitment. So there was this law, and if they had violated this law, even in the open, there was nobody to enforce this commitment. Who would have done it? The Supreme Court. It was only created in October, and today it would have done something because it took upon itself a lot of privileges and powers, but back then it would not have dared doing anything. So that's about enforcing the credible commitment if it had been violated in the open. But the use of the credible commitment as a red herring, if anybody had found out about the secret financing, there was no way to enforce it legally. There was no court around that would have issued any order to the government to stop it. It was simply not there. So credible commitments and what really happens behind the scenes, maybe it's not enforceable legally. Now, the public can enforce credible commitments sometimes by a revolution, let's say, but they didn't know. And why didn't they know? Because nobody had an incentive to reveal the secret. We're not talking about a case of some dictator funding a government in which someone working at the central bank or the treasury might reveal it to the public, and then there is a revolution. No, this was done by the government to defend the people from extermination. As far as they knew, they were all going to be exterminated had the enemy won. So nobody had an incentive to reveal this secret to the public, and indeed it wasn't. So was credible commitment useless? No, it was useful, but in a different way than what we are used to in credible commitments. It was useful as a red herring. And the fact that the public did not know about it, that was very good. It's kind of weird to say it, but in this case, ignorance was bliss. Because if the public had known that there was inflationary finance, as I said, bank run and morale would have been hurt pretty badly. So it's good that nobody knew about it. And people are talking a lot about financial illiteracy. That was useful too, because there were very, very few cases that I see in the newspapers that people say, well, they're not going to print a currency, but who knows what else they're going to do. Maybe the censorship did not allow the newspapers to elaborate, but people fell for it because they thought, well, money is currency. And the fact that enough people didn't realize that money was also whatever's written in the bank's books, that was useful. When I worked on this project, I recalled some verse from the Bible, and it says, "We know cunning ways, a nation will fall," from Proverbs. And I think this is really befitting because it is written here in Hebrew. That is the logo of the Mossad. So with this, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dror, for that very interesting presentation. I'd remind everyone to write your questions in the Q&A, but I will exercise my privilege as chair to start off and get things going. As my background is actually in central banking, and as a central banker, I have often looked at what is written about what central banks are doing, to sort of what private sector interpretations of what central banks are trying to say, or what they're, maybe they're secretly trying to do something that, the private sector might be able to figure out, or something like this. And of course, coming from a central bank, I would say that that's completely ridiculous. And I feel like your paper, however, will basically give fodder to every Bitcoin social media warrior out there that central banks are, doing things in secret. And I know you said that no one had any incentive necessarily to tell this secret, but even after the event, it was kept so secret for so long. How did this really happen? And do you think that this is possible to repeat today? Or is this a sort of a feature of the time and of a wartime situation? And finally, just your mention of the Darlingskasse, the German example, that this was actually mentioned in the Israeli press. Were people thinking that maybe the government were doing something like this? Or why was it being mentioned at the time?
Okay, so first of all, I am sorry that this is going to feed speculation about central banks today. Is it possible today? I think not. I mean, today the balances of central banks are completely public, and we don't have this structure of private bank and central bank. There could be other shenanigans going on, but not in this exact kind of way. And the mention in the Israeli press was actually, it listed several proposals that was given to the government. So this one proposal was to make up these special banks that would issue currency, and it was written very explicitly that that's how the Germans increase the amount of money without violating any restrictions on the central bank. So it was mentioned as a hypothetical example in July, just before the currency ordinance passed, and that's it. And I never saw it mentioned again. It was actually a proposal for the government, and they didn't have to because they had this private arm of the Anglo-Palestine Bank, which kind of saved them the use of it. They didn't have to do it this way. And the last question was, I'm sorry, forgot.
I think it was how did they manage to keep it secret even after the event for so long?
Oh, yeah. So in August, when the balances of the central bank were published, everybody knew about that this was the amount outstanding on the very last day of 1948. And that's it. Maybe I should check in the archives when these archival documents were made available to the public. Maybe they were hidden for 30 years. Actually, not. So this Anglo-Palestine Bank, it remained a private bank, so its archive was not immediately open to the public. It actually morphed or changed its name to Bank Leumi, which literally means the national bank, and to this day it's one of the two largest banks in Israel. And at some point it gave its archive to the state archive. And this might have happened, I think, decades later. So we had this one researcher from the Hebrew University. His name was Ephraim Kleiman, a colleague of Nathan. And he actually found all this, he actually found related information in the late 70s at the bank, at this private bank. So only later it was transferred to the state archives, where it's now available on the internet. So it was, it was not very easy to find. And the newspapers, they didn't have access to anything other than the very last day of 1948, with the balances of the bank. So that's it.
Okay, well, thank you. So we have a couple of questions. People have a couple of raised hands. Perhaps Charles V. Plotz, you'd like to just ask your question directly. If you unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dror. That was fascinating. And the conclusion that ignorance and illiteracy is bliss is a great one. But I have a problem. And the problem is, where did the money go? Presumably, they were buying equipment, and presumably from abroad. So they were paying with this hidden money, but it had to be changed into foreign currencies to buy tanks and all of that. So what happened to the exchange rates? Another chunk of the money was paid, I suppose, to soldiers. and they couldn't spend it all because of price control. They must have had a pack of money in some form, banknotes or bank accounts. Weren't people getting worried to accumulate all the cash and not being able to spend it?
Okay, so foreign expenses were paid by foreign Jews. Most importantly, Jews in the US paid for tanks and airplanes and ships that were sent to Israel. So I talked here only about the domestic costs, and indeed payment to soldiers and their families, actually. That was the biggest item of expenses. So the soldiers got these paychecks and they went to the bank and cashed it, and the bank had very large reserves. Actually, because it was the largest bank and it was already kind of a national bank, it was the bank of the Zionist movement, it felt responsible before the war started to collect a lot of currency, to have very, very high reserves. There was no central bank during the British period, so it had huge reserves and therefore it could afford it. So soldiers went to the bank and they withdrew enough money to pay their expenses, which, as you very rightfully said, it was moderated by the price controls. They didn't have to withdraw too much money because they couldn't spend it legally. There were lots of, well, the underground economy is very, very large. People spent money there. Were people worried about the currency? Sure, but they had nothing better other than gold. Most people couldn't buy gold. There was really, I mean, everything was, it was a very, very risky period. So you see what happened in southern Israel now, near Gaza 2 weeks ago. That could have happened anywhere in Israel throughout this period of 9 months. That was the mood. So the entire period was extremely risky, very kind of existential war. And well, there was this Israeli currency, people held it and hoped for the best. Whether it was currency or at the bank, or even holding gold coins wasn't going to save you if there was an invasion from Gaza. At that time it was the Egyptian army and they killed you all. Gold coins wouldn't help you. So from what I've learned about wartime episodes, people will do the best they can, but they know that nothing actually guarantees anything, even gold. That's what I sense about what people chose.
Okay, Albrecht Rischel has a long question, so I might invite him to talk also and just explain his question directly.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. This is very interesting. I've done a little bit of work on the on this shadow budgets of Germany, so I could perhaps provide information, also ask you specifically about a few things. My first question is whether the increase in the circulation of treasury bills was in any way publicly known data, or was that kept secret as well? So for full secrecy, you'd need secrecy on both sides, the central bank and the treasury.
The treasury didn't report anything. In 1948, there was nothing.
So they didn't publish anything. Okay, that explains something. So that's like the double secrecy. The second question I have is whether any attempt was made to pay, for instance, for procurement directly with these T-bills, or did they always kind of go through the bank and have them monetized first? Because that would be a big difference with the German schemes that you mentioned, where the idea was to really kind of have advance finance through these bills and monetization only later, or perhaps not at all. So the way you describe it is the T-bills were basically sent to the central bank, or that Anglo-Palestinian bank, and were monetized, and then basically the bank balances were used for payment. So no attempt was apparently made to pay with the T-bills directly. Is that correct?
That's what I know from bank documents. That's what I know. Maybe there was something going on with other private corporations, but I think none of them was big enough. I mean, this bank was by far the largest,
because
the
that
largest
would,
company.
I understand that would mark a major difference to the German schemes, and here perhaps the analogy would really break down. And in a way, it's surprising to me because I've absolutely no doubt that, as you mentioned, these German schemes were known in Israel at the time. Because these things had been discussed extensively in German economic circles during the Great Depression. And there were enough people in the trade union movement, whatever, who had to emigrate beginning in 1933. So surely this was public knowledge. So the interesting thing is to me, why no attempt was made to kind of postpone monetization? Apparently the urgency of the situation simply did not allow it. But that would be my suggestion to you, that you basically check if there is any evidence of that. The Treasury trying to use the T-bills directly as a means of payment, and then that's of course important, and then suppress circulation, because that's what the Germans did. They basically stuffed these T-bills into the accounts of big business, and then told them there's no way you can basically start circulating them as quasi money, and they cited military secrecy. But the idea was, the economics behind it was to basically mop up excess liquidity from the market. So they had let's say, an early idea of what a liquidity trap is. German proto-Keynesians knew that stuff, and that was apparently the idea behind it. And you wouldn't really have that in Israel, I suppose, in 1948. So that, I believe, is the limit to the analogy, but I'm not sure. I'm asking.
So I don't have any evidence of the Treasury doing any business with anyone else, actually.
Yeah.
The Treasury, I do need to check better if all my data is only from the bank's documents. I don't remember at the moment if it's all from the bank's documents or also from Treasury documents. I should look into this more.
There would be a second way of doing the same thing. Sorry if I talk so much, but I'm a little bit of an expert on these things. So it's fascinating, except for the dire circumstances of the whole thing. One way of achieving the same would be for the bank to open balances, but not really like sight deposits, but instead in the way of term deposits. It could be that they basically they could have tried to achieve the same thing by writing some sort of a term contract. So the question would be, were the accounts, the balances that the bank made available, could they be drawn upon immediately? Could the firms that were paid with that draw upon the money immediately, or did they build in some frictions in order to kind of slow down inflation, which apparently they had lots of techniques for?
As far as I can tell, everything was immediately. There were no restrictions.
Okay. Okay, then it's done. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. That's really interesting.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple of questions in the chat, and we got one by email about from William English about currency demand at the time, asking if there was immigration and if there was like an increase in currency demand as a result of this or anything else, and whether the British mandate money, the pounds, was still in circulation, or what the actual currency was at the time.
Okay, so the government, the state was founded in May, and in August they had this currency ordinance that told everyone you have 1 month to replace the currency, only the paper money. Replace that with Israeli money. They were given a month. They extended it to another month, but by October, all the British currency was held actually by the bank, and later it converted it into sterling in the UK. British coins were still in use for another year. So the whole story is about paper money. And as I said, at some point, the entire economy went upside down. So production collapsed because 1/6 of the population was drafted. So we're talking about 100,000 men out of an entire population of 600,000, and they were drafted for months. And because these were mostly, working age men, much of the expense of the government was to pay their families. So production almost collapsed. Consumption increased because soldiers consume more when they're in their barracks than when they're home. That's well known in wars. So consumption increased. Immigration was actually started being really considerable only in 1949, because during war, not many people wanted to immigrate to Israel, including my grandparents. So that wasn't a major factor in this exact period. In 1949, it was, and later even more. So we can't really tell what happened in terms of simple quantity theory of money. The movements were just huge. So cannot really tell.
Okay, so we have two other questions. One I think you might have touched on already with from Colleen Holloway about why did the secrecy last so long, but also was it eventually given up on? Why has it finally come out? And I guess that's thanks to your work. And Stefano Battolosi asked a sort of a related question, I think, which is that, was there, given the inflation that there was at the time and the surprise around the size of the balance sheet when it was finally published, was there any kind of legacy from this, in terms of the credibility of the central bank in later years, maybe, around other periods of conflict or similar?
That's a good question. I think that they did not reveal the entire picture, even in August 1949, because of that, because they still wanted the credibility, not only for the bank, but also for the government. The government also had to be credible. Politically, it wasn't very stable in the very first years of the state. So I think that's why they kept it a secret. Actually, they postponed publishing the balances. I mean, think about it. They only published in August the balances for December. That's very late. So I think they tried to postpone and to minimize the amount of information they had to reveal as much as they could, to keep everyone's credibility. Because as I mentioned earlier, there was still some inflationary finance going on under the funny name of land bills, which is definitely taken from the German example after the hyperinflation. So they still wanted to keep credibility and not come fully clean. And I guess at some point, the whole episode was just forgotten. And that's why we are here, the economic historians.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, that seems like a good note to wrap up. We're just on the hour. So thank you very much to Dror Goldberg for your very interesting presentation and discussion. A reminder to everyone that the next seminar is in 2 weeks. On November 8th, and it is a paper that will be presented by David Chambers and Elroy Dimson on long-run asset returns. And also a reminder that there's a more informal 15-minute session for anyone who wants to stick around after this right now. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
So if people are sticking around, they can put questions in the Q&A, and we can also unmute people if they want to raise their hand and chat.
So hi, Dror. Very interesting presentation. So following the discussion by Albrecht and your own presentation, can you say something a little bit more general about the use of because there is this literature, which is not too extensive, about the use of inside money versus outside money and its inflationary effects. And so how does that fit with that literature in terms of because they were using, so it was done through the banking division, which is inside money. And like if it would have been a central bank and a private bank, then this is how we would characterize it in some sense, or that's the way the Bank of England in 1848, I mean, the whole discussion was on this. So is it kind of easier to sterilize in some sense? Or I don't know. What are your thoughts about this? Because
well, my thoughts are that I've been very confused throughout the research whether to think about it as a private bank with fractional reserves or as a public bank, a central bank. And this duality is really confusing. I'm not sure how to think about it in terms of inside and outside money. I mean, it can kind of it can play both characters. That's kind of the funny thing here. It's a private public bank like the Bank of England.
Yeah, I mean, it's true, but it would be an interesting kind of way to explore this a little bit further using kind of the more theoretical literature on this and see whether it conforms with some of these. I mean, it would be a nice angle to take the paper if you want to get it to a more macro monetary audience on top of the economic historians. I think that could be it's an interesting episode to look for in that respect.
Yeah, that's right. All right. I'll think about it.
Right, because in a sense, I mean, maybe there's not only bliss to ignorance and illiteracy, but also to unclear mandate, right? Because this bank doubled, if I understood correctly, both as the largest by far commercial bank, right? Where people naturally would deposit their balances, right? So in a sense, if you were the only bank, right, in land, the operations would almost cancel, right? So initially you issue these secret T-bills, you credit to the government's bank account, the treasury account in the bank, and then effectively you transfer those balances to the deposits of the soldiers and the corporations, also in the same bank. So it's effectively, you're almost like sterilizing your monetary operation by default, right? Because there's no alternative to move it to a bank, to move it elsewhere, right? So you described your perhaps repressed or delayed inflation as just a pass of magic, right, as it were, or obfuscation. But it might just also be the case that people were not, if there were price controls, and of course during an economy of war, there's only limited stuff you can buy, right? If the money just came back to the bank or remained just transferred from one account to the other, then why would there be inflationary pressure?
Well, the money was taken out by the soldiers and the families to buy food. I still don't know exactly how soldiers were paid, whether it was by cash or some money order. I do know that most blue-collar workers didn't have bank accounts. Mm-hmm. Only the middle class and the rich had bank accounts. So many soldiers didn't even have bank accounts. So mm-hmm. There was a lot of currency going on in the economy. So it wasn't just, on the books after the operations with the treasury. A lot of currency was going around.
I understood from reading the paper that the Anglo-Palestine Bank had hoarded a lot of currency in advance, and I guess that they were using this, right?
Yeah, because there was no central bank. There was a Palestine currency board, mm-hmm. which wouldn't bail out any bank. And in the 1930s, they had a major banking crisis, and many banks failed because, what was it, Italy-Ethiopian war, and many banks collapsed. And since then, the banks started accumulating lots of reserves because there was nobody else to help them. And the Anglo-Palestine Bank knew that trouble was going to happen, so it collected lots of currency in advance to prepare for the war. And that was probably critical to keep this operation going.
I see Guido Traficante is asking, could you interpret this as helicopter money in a modern phraseology?
Well, definitely not helicopter currency. Helicopter money? Yeah, maybe. mean, it did reach a very significant amount of the population. And 1/6 of the population, of the entire population, 1/6 were drafted. Like, that affected almost everybody. And the families actually received a lot of money because soldiers received food from the military, but the families had to go shopping for food. And there were many more people at home. So yeah, this really affected everyone.
And if I may come back, so you mentioned that foreign acquisition of military material were mostly paid by the Jewish diaspora. Did the Jewish diaspora also send remittances domestically? I'm sort of, asking the reverse question from Charles, right? Rather than spending the Israeli pounds and having to buy pounds, did the reverse happen?
Not so much. Ben-Gurion decided to have this conceptual split, not to mix the funds. He wasn't a great financier, so I don't know why he made this decision. Maybe he had other motives. It's not really explained. I read his diary throughout. He simply decided money outside will be spent for buying weapons. Money inside will be used for buying inside stuff. That's it. That was just his decision. Whenever people offered him to kind of transfer this way or another, he said no. I don't know. That was his decision. Maybe because maybe he was afraid of foreign exchange stuff. I don't know.
Okay. All right.
Could I come back in and ask, use my privilege as chair again, just to get your sense on how much do you think that this was, a deliberate deception? Do you think that, it was deliberately written in the ordinance that, they couldn't print money, that this, and, to what extent it might have been, you could do mental gymnastics and think that this was legitimate to split the bank into an issue department and a banking department and have different things going on? And to what extent do you think everyone knew that this was just deceptive and they were doing this to, for the country and they had to do it?
So I don't have a smoking gun of someone saying in real time, well, deceiving the public and this is why and stuff like that. But the example of the Bank of England, if they had followed it exactly, would have been for the banking department to also publish its balances every week. And they didn't. So that was the difference. They didn't. They should have if they only wanted to imitate the Bank of England. And again, I think it worked because of the gold prices. That's a major source of evidence, I think. Outside of the censored newspapers, I have nothing really. So that's my evidence. Was there anything else?
No, it was more just your sense. Do you think, I know that the deception worked and that, it was a deception, but do you think that people felt like it was, the people who were doing it, believed it to be deceptive, or, were they doing some kind of mental gymnastics and sort of justifying it to themselves?
So we have this very late admission that I mentioned by the strongman in the Treasury 26 years later. He said, yeah, we deceived the public. That's what I have later. In real time, I don't have anything. I do have something. So a month before the currency ordinance, I have this bank chairman, this Dutch banker, Eliezer Hoefijn. He was a very strict guy. He was Dutch, but he was mentally kind of one of those German Jews who were very, very, very strict. And he wrote to Ben-Gurion, this is not going to work. We are going to print too much money. So he kind of, he said, well, we're going to have a problem. This will be inflationary finance out in the open. And then something happens, and then a month later, the bank is split, and the balances of the banking department are secret, which a month earlier, this chairman of the bank thought that they would be public. So something happened, and it turned from a huge problem into a secret. And so something happened there. I don't know, who was behind it. He definitely knew it was a problem because, again, I have it in writing. He wrote to the treasurer, to the minister of finance. He wrote to Ben-Gurion. We are going to have a huge problem here of inflationary finance. And well, then he kind of he remained the chairman of the bank when it was secret inflationary finance. So he knew this was going on, and then he was appointed the inflation czar, which is just chutzpah.
Dror, I have another comment or some suggestion. If you want to, I mean, some episode that could be, I mean, it's not similar, but it has some similar flavor, is looking at the inflationary period in the Napoleonic Wars when the Bank of England went off gold. And so again, this real bills thing where sort of, this is not going to create any inflation type of arguments that they had at the time. And as long as the exchange rate didn't show, they continued with this for quite a while until in 1810, you had the Bullion Committee, and with the exchange rate depreciating. And then also the bank was forced to publish the parliament forced the bank to publish more higher frequency balance sheets, because beforehand they provided the balance sheets with a long delay and also not very frequently. And so this was a part of a result of this. But for a while, the British government, the Bank of England, they kind of collaborated on this with no discernible and then during the Bullion Report, some of those people obviously complained about this kind of being a deception. And I mean, some people were very vocal about this at the time. So it could be kind of a nice anecdote to compare with. It's not exactly the same, I agree, but it's and on that note also, I don't recall if Israel at that time, what was the exchange rate regime formally at because beforehand that the British sterling, the Israeli pound sterling, which was kind of linked to the British pound, but when they did this conversion with this, where they were still pegging this, or there wasn't kind of an implicit guarantee that this would be pegged, so they were operating on this on a fixed exchange rate when doing all this.
Yeah, it was still fixed. The only hope of any value for the Israeli currency was to keep it like the sterling. Yes. So, yeah.
Okay, any final questions?
I'm puzzled. I mean, I don't know how they got away, right, with doing covert inflationary funding and peg the Israeli pound to the sterling. I mean, it's not like sterling was very stable in this period either, but yeah, right.
Well, everything was very strictly supervised. I mean, there was no free exchange of currency.
Oh, okay.
So it was this official exchange rate, and the government did whatever it wanted.
And then there was currency, FX rationing, something.
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Well, this has been fun. Thank you very much. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for everyone who's still around. And come again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dror.
Bye.
Bye.